Good afternoon. My name is Louis Hicks. I'm the Director of Grants and Special Projects, and this is our July monthly meeting for the DC Living Heritage Network. We are pleased to have today our keynote speaker, Joanne Henson. Joanne is a director and member of our DC Living Heritage Network. Without further ado, I'll bring Joanne forward and allow her to tell us about her organization as well as speak to our topic. Our topic this month in our ongoing series allows our members to tell us how the DC Living Heritage Network has assisted them in moving forward their agenda, as well as also giving them skills and skill building. So today Joanne is going to share with us her thoughts around the DC Living Heritage Network, as well as also talking about how she has facilitated our work and also moved forward her plan. So Joanne Henson, please come forward, and please join me in welcoming her.
Okay, I guess I won't be nervous about this. First, I would like to thank the DC Humanities Council and the DC Living Heritage Network for this opportunity to speak to the value and asset of this organization. Second, it's my understanding of the DC Living Heritage Network, their belief in inclusion, collaboration, and capacity building, support of the humanities, heritage, and preservation. Do you have projects or ideas that need developing? Do you want to develop your nonprofit? It's the joy of the leadership and the support of the DC Living Heritage Network that makes this possible and gives Henson Arts and Learning the opportunity to succeed. Every week, I sit at the table with an economist, arts and humanities administrators, teachers, artists, people who work in the film and entertainment industry, which is a networking experience. During each session, our discussions of business plans, developing strategic plans, websites, and the importance of social media to promote your organization is talked about. Financial planning and other capacity building activities. Work in progress, Henson Arts and Learning, which has been enriched and enhanced from this collective. I had previous support from grants from SYP, Department of Employment Services, DC Commission of the Arts and Humanities, support from churches, the Office of Partnership and Grants, ANC, and the Foundation Center. I feel that this network gives a more personal touch to my vision. Henson Arts and Learning. We weave, we quilt, we sew. We also explore our traditions and culture through the arts and humanities. Children and youth need the understanding of traditional methods used for preserving our heritage. How to sustain an organization like Henson Arts and Learning. DC Living Heritage must continue to serve as the parent body for emerging nonprofits. In conclusion, DC Living Heritage has allowed Henson Arts and Learning to develop more ideas on paper, and by developing its business plan will bring more clarity to the organization's functions. Are there any questions or comments? Okay. Jarvis?
Yes, Joanne. Thanks for being here this afternoon. Could you give me an idea of one of the programs that had received funding? I remember you had done some work with literacy along with quilt making. How did that work?
Okay, that was during the summer when I worked with the youth, the SYP. That was like 40 youth. So during that 6-week period, our first week dealt with the quilting and weaving. And we also had Dr. Dobard, who was a professor at Howard for like 36 years, who is like a master quilter, and he's also a historian with quilts that work with the children on the history of the quilts. And he was more of like a hands-on, teaching them the panels and how to create the panels and discuss the historical significance of the panels. And that was the first week. The second week we dealt with hip hop and spoken word. And it's very important for the youth to express their passions, their lifestyles. What they don't understand, a lot of times they will put on paper and in poetry, and they'll put it in poetry. And that was funded by SYB for summer program. And it was 6 weeks, and I had a sculptor, and I'm getting cloudy, but there was artists every week. 1 week it was a media artist, and another week there was a person who helped them with understanding how to put together a show, an exhibit. Yes, thank you. Marty?
When did H.A.I.L get started, and why did you start this organization?
I really want to not tell this story, but I had a good neighbor who was a poet, and she told me that she had heard a radio broadcast of a director from the DC Trust, and they had just received like $6 million for programming for middle school kids. She was revising my resume, so she said, what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to write a letter. And they called me right away. So what she told me was, when you go, you need to be a program. And what she said was, you could be Henson Arts and Learning, and we will put down the objectives, the goals, and everything in writing. So when you go and you talk to the director, you have a program. And that's how H.A.I.L got its beginning. And then I gathered around my friends who helped me develop my, 501c. And then I just went off running to see what I could do as a artist, arts administrator, and what I could contribute to the community.
So what was it about quilting that really attracted you?
The quilting part was more of the tradition. As a kid, I learned how to sew, I'm sewing. But it came more to life when, through Dr. Dobard's work, he talked about the tradition of the Underground Railroad and how the panels were significant to the Underground Railroad. And in his book that he co-wrote, Hidden in Plain View, that became a project that I did with after-school programs, camps, because kids like that hands-on interaction with fabric and thread, and I've had kids as young as 5 that will sew quilts. Any more questions?
Yes, Joanne. So what are some of your present or future projects? What are you trying to develop now with the DC Cultural Network?
You mean the Living and Heritage Network?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, one of the reasons why I go every week, as I said in my presentation, and it's something that was said at the table, I have a group of people who have a vast amount of experience. They can share the do's and don'ts and the how and what I need to be doing. And what I actually started in the last couple of months was collaborating with a program, with an after-school program. And what we did, I decided to try to go in during the day and bring in a program, because the school has no art programming for pre-K to third graders. And I thought this was an opportunity for me to partner with the school.
So you're continuing your work with, is this an after-school program or is it during?
Actually, this was a volunteer situation.
Okay.
Now, I usually just like to do what I do. So I might go to the community festivals and just set up a table and work with the kids in the environment. But now that I realize that I'm looking at it as a business, I need to generate revenue. And it's not just from grants, it might be from corporations, community people, because I go out and I seek funding and people who can support me. I actually, when I set up my nonprofit, I went to the Office of Grants and Partnerships and Grants, and it was a day session that assisted me in finishing the 1023 form. And that's how I actually completed everything in a timely fashion from that support. And I had to write a narrative, and then I have friends who have worked with OSSI and other places. And I should note one thing. One of the things that has supported me the most are people that I know, people I went to school with, people who are in the community that have some of the same goals that I have. So if I ask them to support me, I get that support. So I see my moving along as like a journey, but I have support in that journey.
So if someone was getting ready to start their community project or program, what would be the best advice or the best practices you think they should start their whole thing?
I think the best advice that they would have is to decide on the target group of people that they wanted to work with and what their vision would be in working. If you want to work in the community, what is it that you want to do with the community? And how are you going to, make those goals and your vision and your goals, transform into, an actual program. I think the easiest part is putting together the program. Running the programs may be the difficult part, and finding money, grants. It becomes like a search, because you have competition and you have other people doing the same things that you're doing. But what I'm going to step back and say, maybe they need to come and sit at the table on Tuesday at the DC Living Heritage Network. And it sort of gives you that flow. It gets you kind of like, because the people that are sitting there are actually, they have experience, they're looking for more, and they can sort of push you further than you would think, just from those sessions.
So by going through the sessions, they help to motivate you, point you in other directions that you might not have thought about, or?
I think when I started, I was doing a lot of things, but I think what happens in the sessions, it sort of slows me down and allows me to become patient. And this is one comment that I have. I think anyone who's starting an organization, maybe not a project, but an organization, needs to understand the importance of the business plan, the initial steps of the business plan, because it gives you it allows you to put your ideas on paper, and you start to explore the do's and don'ts. I don't think it was any don'ts. It was just some of the things that I was doing was not enough because I'm like a one-person staff. Although I am a one-person staff, but I have support from friends. Like if I call someone who is a grant writer and they'll say, okay, I'll help you, and they're explaining to me what some of the questions on the grants are. I think right now with all the things that I've done, I'll have a 15-page business plan soon because I've done a lot.
So you use doing a project versus the organization?
So when I say the organization, I'm saying my organization doesn't have funds to operate as an organization, so I see it as projects. Like saying going after the DC Commission on the Arts, I'm looking at it having a 9-month program. The organization doesn't function as an organization with operating funds that I could actually pay myself or pay employees. But when I look at the budgets that I set for the projects, I can facilitate what I'm trying to achieve.
So is it the lack of like multi-year funding, or that's something that you need to achieve so you can move to being able to institutionalize your programs, like a summer program that you know if I have it this year, I'll be able to have it next year.
And that's one of the discussions that we've had at the table of how you are strategically planning your organization. And one of the things that I see with what I'm doing, it's just projects. If I could go after operating funds, or if I could go after planning monies, the different types of monies that you can find, that's like one of my next steps, because it's kind of a lot of work when you are in search of money. I used to go to the Foundation Center like every other day, and I would see people there. I was like, oh God. But the librarian would guide you to the corporations, foundations that would support your ideas. And that was when I looked at organizations that I had worked for in the past, and I would start to pull up their 990, and I would be able to know who funds them, you know, and why they have $1 million, you know, money. And then I also could find out why some of the funding was sometimes they were not giving the monies back again. So it's having a staff would be great, but being a one-person show, you end up multitasking all the time. And it was one thing that I learned from at our table is that for me, I had to learn that I needed to have days of rest, days of, I guess, reflection for myself, because you can actually get burned out from your vision and your dream because you're just moving. What do I do next? So I'm looking at meditation. That's something I do, and learning how to play the guitar, but that's on my time, you know, and looking, because someone who worked with me on H.A.I.L had told me that your organization is bigger than you are, and that you had to understand that you needed support, and you can't run an organization on a volunteer. a volunteer staff. So, and, you know, I've been taking the easy way. So I do it as projects, and I know that I can maintain it. And that's the, when we start looking at capacity building, looking at my board, looking at, do I have a fundraising board? Do I have an advisory board? Do I have people who facilitate the programs for me? I have artists. I need the teaching artists. You know, I went to Howard Fine Arts. I know artists. I know teaching artists. And now I'm finding people who are administrators. Administrators who, and that's, I'm the artist person. The administration part is like learning.
So is that part of what Living Heritage Network, does that help you in terms of leadership development, having a support network? Have you been able to partner or think about partnering with any of the other participants?
Actually, I've had discussions with a few people at the table. But I think another thing that I'm seeing, I think you missed the section when I talked about the people that were at the table. At the table, there's an economist. There is arts and humanities administrators. You have teachers, dancers, instructors, and all of those people have that experience. So it kind of gets me in the feel of what it is that I need to be doing. I know I need an administrative staff. I would be able to breathe, or a grant writer, or people that you could, you know, hire to do projects for you. And the last meetings that we had at the Living Heritage Network that dealt with the business plan and the financial planning and the website design, if I just took those 4 things and just focused on them, nothing else, I could see moving forward more quickly. And knowing how to reach out to other people, that's another thing that I'm learning that's really important. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Jerome Panes, and I was given a title a couple months ago as what is my title? The facilitator of the DC Living Heritage Network. So the DC Living Heritage Network got formed in 2014, a number of activities in 2015, 2016. This round, FY 2017, we've been focusing on capacity building of organizations devoted to promoting humanities, heritage, and preservation. Along with that act, which takes place on the weekly meetings, we've had a series of monthly meetings that have focused on best practices. And we thought we were going to be in a position to discuss the DC Cultural Plan. The DC Cultural Plan planning process got started last year, and because of the way these plans get developed, there have been delays, no criticisms, just takes longer than you think. And so we thought by this time, by August, July and August of this year, there would have been a draft of the DC Cultural Plan, and we would be discussing that draft with members of the DC Living Heritage Network and other stakeholders that are part of the Humanities DC. We don't have a DC cultural plan to talk about today, but we do have a cultural plan to talk about. And it's the New York City Cultural Plan. And what I'd like to do is to take some time to look at the New York City Culture Plan, which was released on July 19th, just a few days ago, and look at it through the lens of the legislation, the goals, and the activities surrounding the DC Culture Plan. So I'd like to do that in two parts. One, you should have in front of you a handout, which is an excerpt from the online New York Times, which is an article that was dated July 19, 2017, on the New York Culture Plan. So what I'd like to do is stop the camera a little bit and let's take about we're going to see whether we can juggle, so we can juggle three documents simultaneously. We don't want the camera to shift around. We want the camera can stay on the cultural plan site. But we have the article from the New York Times, and then we have another handout. And if you look at the first page of the handout, you'll see that what I've listed are the goals of the DC Culture Plan. The goals go from A through J. One is increasing participation in cultural activities. I won't read them all, but one of the things we want to try to do is to seek the extent to which the New York Culture Plan aligns with any of the goals that we would like to see here in DC. So we have the screen, we have the article, New York Times article, and we have the handout in front of us. So let's start with the New York Times article, and like any good news article, it needs to have what? It starts with a what? No, I mean just as a news article. A news article wants to do what? You grab the attention of the reader. Mm-hmm. So this particular reporter, Robin Progribbian, considered what would be, she gets a copy of the New York Cultural Plan, she reads it, she calls around, checks her sources, and what does she find, what does she think is the lead from the New York Cultural Plan? What does she lead with? Money, but what kind of money?
Money from New York's education.
What does she see as the number one thing? What does she write? What's covered in her first paragraph?
Diversity.
Okay, linking diversity to funding, right? These arts groups, we don't know yet what those arts groups are because we're just in the first paragraph of the article. But according to the author, the journalist, there's a group of organizations over here that in order to get continued funding from the city, they need to meet certain diversity goals. Mm-hmm. Right. Now, why would you think she would consider that the most important thing? I mean, you don't know this, but the plan runs like 180 pages. So out of that, why do you think she hones in on that?
Because it's not being addressed, diversity.
Okay, so there's a belief that diversity is not being addressed. Diversity in what fashion? Staffing of the organization, and what else?
The leadership, the board members.
The leadership, the board members,
And their ability to reach out to communities.
Ability to reach out to communities, and also
And the institutions and museums.
the museums. All right, so that we know if we look at this plan in more detail, we should find something about how New York City plans to link future funding for museums and art groups to the diversity of their employees and board members. I thought that was quite a phenomenal statement. I don't know whether, we'll go on to that. So one of the things that the legislation that established the DC Culture Plan is also issues of diversity and inclusion. So one of the goals of the plan, when it's finally finished, is to figure out how we overcome the inequities in terms of who has access to cultural resources, what kinds of groups are funded, And so we find that in the New York City plan, at least according to this reporter, if we're going to have a cultural plan for New York City, the cultural plan should focus on inclusion and equity. Is that something we could use here in DC?
Without a doubt.
You said without a doubt?
Yeah.
Right. All right. So this theme of inclusion and equity is something that when we look at the draft or the DC cultural plan when it comes out, we can say, well, the legislation focused on, that established the planning process focused on inclusion and equity. New York City is focused on inclusion and equity. And then we have some basis for comparing, and what would that comparison be? Partly, I mean, clearly scale in New York is much bigger than DC, but we can say, you know, how do they define the issue? How do we define the issue? We meaning here, us in DC, and then how do we overcome the gaps? Does that sound reasonable? Okay. So after we move beyond the question of inclusion and equity, then there's what other theme, I guess we get around to page 3 of the handout, what other theme surfaces that, if you look at the third paragraph on the top of page 3, the last sentence of that, somebody want to read what that says?
Third paragraph,
The third paragraph,
last sentence.
last sentence of the third paragraph.
Oh, Mr. de Blasio pledged on Wednesday?
Yes.
Mr. de Blasio pledged on Wednesday to increase money for the less prominent groups, many in the neighborhoods outside of Manhattan.
Okay. Can you say that one more time?
And Mr. de Blasio pledged on Wednesday to increase money for the less prominent groups, many in the neighborhoods outside Manhattan.
Okay, so we're talking here, we're on camera, we haven't filled in all the blanks, but who is Mr. de Blasio?
Man.
He's the current mayor of New York City, and so obviously this is, in one sense, it's an executive office, it's quote unquote his plan, even though several people work to put it together. There's a cultural commissioner and so forth. So what does this suggest that the plan is trying to address, the New York City plan is trying to address? On the one hand, there's what?
Centralization of art museums and everything in the city, in Manhattan.
Right, so there's Manhattan seems to be getting the bulk of the money, and one goal of the plan is to do what?
How do you reach the other
About
parts of the city?
How to reach the other boroughs, other parts of the city, and the term that's used in the news article is what? What kind of groups?
Less prominent.
The less prominent groups. So do we know any less prominent groups? We're all here. We represent the less prominent groups. So we're the less prominent groups. So do we want to own that label? Or, no, we want to become from less prominent to what? Prominent. Okay. Now there is the next paragraph speaks to a Mr. Finkel Pearl, and Mr. Finkel Pearl, if we go back to the beginning on the top of page 2, is the Commissioner of Cultural Affairs for New York City, and so he would be equivalent to what here in DC? Yeah. Do we have a counterpart in DC? Okay, the DC Commission for Arts and Humanities. We don't call it Cultural Affairs. We would like for one day for it to be called Cultural Affairs, but that's a political battle that we won't fight today. But Mr. Finkel Pearl is the Commissioner for Cultural Affairs, and on the top of paragraph 4, what does he say about the plan?
On page 2 or 3?
Page 3, paragraph 4.
The cultural plan was a roadmap rather than a guarantee of future changes to city arts funding.
Right. All right. So he's not saying this plan is not a budget document, but it suggests what?
There needs to be some changes.
And when there is a budget,
There will be some.
this is a guide for how the money should be spent. And so one of the key goals of the legislation for DC is that the cultural plan should come up with a funding plan as well. And that's a key component. It won't be I don't think it will be a budget. We don't know what it is. I mean, we don't know what it is. I'm not saying that critically, is that the Office of Planning is still working on the document. So the goal number, I was trying to figure out what goal that was. Oh, it was in another component in the RFP, which talked about how ultimately the plan, the DC Culture Plan, should focus on directions where the funding for the district should go in terms of its spending on arts, humanities, preservation, and heritage. On paragraph 5, what does Mr. Finkel Pearl add?
I would consider it a failure if we don't have a measurable increase in cultural resources in those parts of the city that aren't being reached right now in 5 years.
Right. So if you're looking, it's 5 years from now, so this is 2017. If you're looking ahead, it's now 2022, you're looking back. What would he like to see have happened over that 5-year period?
We'd like to see this plan implemented.
Implemented, and more particularly, what would be a measure of success?
More museums and things outside of Manhattan.
Right, more resources, more resources outside of Manhattan. Okay, and you can measure that. How can you measure that? You know what the resources are today.
Yeah, if it's not there.
Right, you can measure. Okay, the next paragraph speaks to another sort of equity issue or diversity issue, and that paragraph speaks to what? That's paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's paragraph 6.
75% of New Yorkers say that they wish that they could attend arts and cultural activities more often.
Okay, so there seems to be, based on some data, that people would like to participate more. What's the lead sentence say of that paragraph?
Cultural participation is 20% higher among New Yorkers' highest income earners than its lowest earners, according to the plan.
Right, so it says that the more money you have, the more likely you are to what? Participate in cultural activities. So one of the things you would want to do with the cultural plan is to do what? Increase the participation rate of the bottom 80%.
To make it more affordable.
Make it more affordable. What else? Could not more accessible, affordable, and so forth. Okay. Then the 7th paragraph talks about what? That's just a one-sentence paragraph.
Geographical inequities.
And that's just another way of saying what? Geographical inequities. If there's some,
The rich versus the poor.
well, but there's some downtown, and then there's some out in the boroughs or Manhattan versus, so the money is not
Evenly dispersed.
It's not dispersed in a way that, doesn't necessarily have to be dispersed equally, but it's not dispersed in a way that, at least our understanding from the article, that promotes active participation for all New Yorkers. So, and then what do we find out in paragraph 8? What kind of geographical diverse inequities are there? How do you find the geographical inequities? What are the boundaries? Or
Transportation.
transportation, right? All right. And in DC, we talk about the geographical diversities as what? What are our boundaries?
Wards.
Wards. What else? What else? East of the river, west of the park. So we have geographical areas in DC as well. Wards, the rivers, the parks, and we want to see the distribution of cultural activities and spending in such a way that it allows access that overcomes those geographical boundaries. Then on the last paragraph, which goes over on page 3, paragraph 9, which goes over to the top of page 4, what else do we find about funding of arts in New York City?
Seems like it's kind of like who you know, because they say it's a case-by-case basis, and there's no real true criteria or consistency on how you, who gets what.
A case-by-case basis, it just kind of grew, and ostensibly one of the reasons that the legislation was passed and the funding was provided in order to conduct the DC Cultural Plan is to come up with criteria for allocating cultural resources in the District of Columbia. And so within the nomenclature for us here at Humanities DC and the DC Living Heritage Network, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, is the question of do you fund institutions or do you fund individuals and communities? And as we've seen in the last budget round, there was extra money put in the budget for the DC Commission on Arts and Humanities, but it was all geared toward institutions. So we say, okay, if you're gonna give some extra money, why give it to the institutions? Why not give it more to, or at least some of that money? If you're gonna earmark money, or if you're gonna make available competitive grants, then earmark it to neighborhoods and communities and allow that funds to be available. So there is a bias still, even before the plan comes out in DC, that the money is still going toward institutions as opposed to communities, neighborhoods, and individuals. Now, if we go to what then is the fourth full paragraph on page 4, it starts with the word diversity. And again, what's emphasized? Somebody want to read that first paragraph?
Diversity was emphasized throughout the cultural plan. A study conducted by the Cultural Affairs Department last year found that 67% of city residents identified as members of minorities, yet only 38% of employees at cultural organizations belong to these groups.
Right. So that gets back to the same theme, is that the city is 67% diverse and the organizations and their employees are only 38% diverse.
What got me was the least white jobs are maintenance and security.
Right.
That's
So, right. So that there's an overrepresentation of minorities, the maintenance and security jobs, and an underrepresentation in the other jobs. And what are the whitest jobs?
Curators.
Curators. and what is a curator? Anybody want to?
Person in charge of museum collection or someone in charge of developing exhibitions related to a collection at that institution.
So what ultimate control or power or influence does a curator have?
For the institution.
They can set a vision for the institution or for the collection or for the, yes?
For what art that we see.
What art we have seen, right?
Mm-hmm.
As well as direct the story that you are interpreted.
Right, direct. So the curator becomes important, right? And we know that all curators, just because of their race, they're not biased. I would never say that because I've seen some, but we know that you can get different stories if you have a diverse set of curators. And that's part of a process that we see throughout society, whether it's in corporations or in academic institutions, is that diversity can be defined in a lot of different ways. We can define it racially, we can define it economically, we can define it culturally. But what we find is that when diversity happens, that you begin to get different types of stories, different types of collections, different types, people be able to see themselves. For those of us who have had an opportunity to go to the Museum for African American History and Culture, we see the effects of curation and how that has influenced people, how they respond to collections and so forth. Now, if you go to the last paragraph on page 4, which would be paragraph 8, what does the plan call for?
Increasing funds for individual artists.
Increasing funds for individual artists. Does that ring positively here?
Yeah.
Is that something we'd like to see in the DC Culture Plan? Okay, all right.
Now, what's interesting about New York is that DC does actually support more individual arts programming than New York does. I mean, it's really kind of strange. I guess it's because we're not a state.
Mhm.
But when I was trying to help my daughter get some funding, I mean, it was like really difficult. And so they definitely need some help there, but we're actually a little bit ahead of them on that.
Okay, all right. Even though we're ahead, we'd like to see what?
More.
More. All right. And so what would some of that new money go toward, according to the newspaper journalists?
Train more minority applicants.
For-
Jobs.
So training for cultural jobs,
Improve interpretation services and arts organizations.
okay. So being able to mount things in other than in English, interpretation services, and then improve access for disabilities. So the plan is more than just about seeking a balance between the institutions in Manhattan and the boroughs, or Manhattan and non-Manhattan, but it looks at a broader range of issues. Then at the first full paragraph at the top of page 5, in addition to focusing on culture, what does this focus on?
Environmental improvements.
Environmental improvement. So we want to reduce green. So if there are cultural organizations, the plan also wants to help them reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So buildings, appliances, energy efficiency. If you move into a building, can you move into one that is more energy efficient? You need to upgrade the building, because if you upgrade the energy efficiency, the water efficiency, the thermal efficiency of a building, the capital costs then the increased capital or the additional capital costs will then ultimately do what? Reduce the long-range operating costs. So over time, your light bill, your heating bill, your air conditioning bill, your water bill would be lower, and your footprint on the environment would be smaller. The third full paragraph on top of page 5 focuses on what?
What do we invest in?
Okay, so there needs to be they want to double down and reinvest in arts and culture. And who's calling for that?
Jimmy Van Brandt,
Jimmy Van Brammer, and who is he?
majority leader of the city council.
Right, so there's a council member, and who's the council member in DC that oversees the Commission on Arts and Humanities?
Anyway,
Big Martin?
Right, so I did. Arts and
she's
humanities.
very involved.
We
Could
can't-
possibly be Grosso, since
Well, Grasso has taken a role in terms of promoting it. You know, I'm drawing a blank too. I don't know whether it's under government operations or it's under. We should Google that.
Yeah, I think so.
So it appears that the head of the majority leader for the city council and the chairman of its cultural affairs committee helped spearhead the legislation to create the plan. We know that in DC, it was Councilmember Grasso that spearheaded the legislation to create the cultural plan. So there is a direct link, and the Van Brammer in New York City is calling to double down and reinvest in the arts and culture. And why is it important to double down and reinvest in the arts and culture?
To help remove barriers.
Help remove barriers.
Like you're making an investment in people.
You're making an investment in the people, and you're making an investment in some assets that distinguish New York in terms of its tourism business. Its a good cultural plan will help focus the identity of the city.
To move people out of Manhattan only to visit museums and culture. They don't go into the Bronx,
Right.
Brooklyn.
Right. So just the tourists. So in DC, we say we want to get the tourists off the malls and to the neighborhoods, from the federal to the local places, and there's some of that. There are the neighborhood tours. You see the buses lined up at Ben Chili Bowl. Yeah, so there's some of that, but we want to have a little bit more of that as we move forward. I tell the story, an anecdote. Many years ago, we, meaning my associate and I, we worked on a tourism study for the District of Columbia. Back in the '80s. I've been around a long time. But back then, there was studies that were done on which areas, which cities, or which countries, or which states had the best tourism slogans. And the two that ranked the highest were, "I love New York," and "It's better in the Bahamas." Anybody remember those?
Yeah.
All right, so now the "I love New York," if you remember any of those ads, what were they trying to get people to do? What were the ads trying to get people to do?
Travel.
Travel to New York, right? To take advantage of all the resources, the entertainment, the fun. And when they did the studies of the effects of the marketing campaign, what they found out that it was more effective for the New Yorkers than for the non-New Yorkers. And if I remember the story, if I remember the study, what it was is that it gave New Yorkers something to identify with. It gave New Yorkers something to rally around. And this is not unusual, because there are slogans and cultural activities that bring communities together. Regardless of where you think about professional sports teams and subsidies for stadiums, when you have a winning team, what do you find out in the community? Everybody what? Prospers, but they also what? Support, come together. We're fans of the Washington franchise. We're football franchise. Everybody is into the blue and gold. So it does create an esprit de corps. Regardless of what where you are politically on it in terms of the dollars that go into stadiums, or in our case in DC, what we think about the quote unquote mascot. But when you have a winning team, it does something to the community. So a cultural plan should kind of do the similar kind of thing. That's my argument. It should provide a way for people to kind of come together, to think about who they are and what it means to be part of this thing called the District of Columbia. So when we based on this article, we find that the New York Culture Plan is going to try to do what? One, improve the diversity of the staffs. It's going to try to improve the diversity of the funding, in terms of groups, and it's going to try to promote the culture of DC, of New York. Right. So,
But also bring it outside of just Manhattan.
somebody just outside of Manhattan. So you think these are ideas that we should, when we look at our cultural plan, the draft should be out soon. when we look at our cultural plan being the DC cultural plan, we can see how New York is doing it. Not that New York should dictate, but then we have some benchmarks to kind of look at what other jurisdictions are doing. For me, if you really want to look at a good cultural plan, look at the one for London. It's a cultural plan on steroids. I don't know what's going to happen now that there's Brexit, but before Brexit, the London cultural plan, in a lot of ways, was the model cultural plan for the world. It's all online, and cultural planning as a city activity, and typically cultural plans are city activities, is more advanced outside the United States than in the United States. It's relatively recent inside the United States. Other plans that we would look at as exemplary would be Chicago's plan, which was completed a couple years ago. Austin has a good plan. All these good blue cities have good cultural plans. And they all seek to deal with this issue of the distribution of resources, the increasing of access, and more importantly, honoring the cultures that exist in the city. And this is what we at Humanities DC and we at the DC Living Heritage Network have been advocating for in the case of the DC Culture Plan. And our advocacy picked up last summer because when we read the draft legislation, there was no mention of the humanities. It wasn't a plan to develop culture. It was an arts plan. And fortunately enough, we were able to note that in time. It was reported to us both directly and indirectly that that was not the intent. And when it came time to issue the RFP in order to hire the consultants to do the cultural plan, many of the ideas that we had put forth were included in the RFP, and we've been reassured so far that the cultural planning process really focuses on the culture and not just the arts, and we feel comfortable with what we've seen so far. So let me stop there. Any questions? Yes, there are two questions here.
Yes, I have a question. Looking at the DC piece here on the first page, F, assessing the current state of art education, and then looking at the New York's plan about the curators being mainly, white. It's been a long time, but I think I remember that DCLHN had a program for museum curators.
They still do.
And that, so I was wondering, I guess, how do we even train people of color to be more curators, to have that pool? Is it in UDC's program?
Now, one of the things the news article highlights is there was a study that was done that looked at the racial distribution of jobs in cultural institutions in New York. I don't know what the distribution of cultural jobs in DC are.
I guess I was thinking more in terms of, I know over the years, many years, a lot of the arts programs that were in the DC public schools have been cut back. Teachers no longer exist. So even if we say these things, how can we support it, I guess? Is there a movement within this cultural plan to make sure there's funding in the public schools and with this, I guess?
Okay, now I can't speak for the Office of Planning, which is the agency in conjunction with the DC Commission on Arts and Humanities and the Office of Cable Television. They're the three executive agencies, meaning mayoral agencies, that are responsible for developing the plan. But based on the engagement process that the Office of Planning has held over the in getting citizen input, there is some sense that these issues are being addressed. So I wouldn't say I think that they're going to hone or follow the guidelines of the legislation. In the handout that I provided on the third page is some graphics we did last year in talking about the developing the culture plan, is that the Office of Planning has some criteria they use for any type of planning they do. So the Office of Planning, they are responsible for the comprehensive plan for the District of Columbia, small area plans, creative economy plans, so that when they look at planning, they look at 6 criteria. And they're using, it's our understanding they're using this criteria when they're looking at the DC Culture Plan as well. And those are contexts, and they're listed there on that page 3. Is it place specific? Again, one way to talk about that is to the extent does it take place at the neighborhood level, at the sidewalk level, or is it taking place somewhere else? It needs to be, for our interpretation of that guideline for the Office of Planning, is that if it's neighborhood based, the planning will focus on where residents live, work, and play and worship. Okay. Then, according to the Office of Planning, that a plan should be hyper-local. So hyper-local means for us, is it by locals and it's for locals. So yes, we'll have the institutions, there'll be the Kennedy Center, there'll be the Source Theater, there'll be these Washington Ballet, a number of established organizations, but there are a lot of ways you can look at that. You can fund the institutions, you can fund the outreach efforts for those institutions, or you can fund the communities. And what we'll be looking for as we assess the DC Culture Plan is to what extent are the programs going to come from the community level up, the neighborhood level up, to the extent that it's going to be buy-in for locals. So one of the criteria, we won't go through all of those, is that is equity. Does the planning address the disparities that exist in the city? And so if we just take the Office of Planning guidelines and look at those in context of the article about the cultural plan in New York, if the Office of Planning follows, when I say follows, these are broad guidelines, you have to, looking at it in particular context, there's some you see a lot of overlap between how the Office of Planning says it does planning and how the culture plan of New York was planned. Mm-hmm. So we would expect some particularly good outcomes from that. How are we doing on time, Louis? 5 minutes? Okay, yes.
So I have a question and a couple of comments. I'll start with one of my comments. You talked about cities and cultures rallying around something, and you had mentioned like a winning team, or people galvanizing. Well, I saw this. It says, "This is our town, our neighborhoods. We love this place as much as you do," and that's the new slogan for the DC Lottery, and it is. I think it is just brilliant.
Okay.
And I saw the visuals that go with that as well. It's focused very much on culture,
Okay.
on the culture of DC, the street level culture, not just the museums,
Right.
or whatever.
and it's really interesting. And coming from the lottery and not coming from an arts or humanities institution is really interesting. And I was wondering if they were partnered or if there was some overlap or something. That was my comment. And then another comment is, in order to bring more Black people into the curating positions, I think that in addition to creating a pipeline to the schools, like this lady has suggested, because they do have kids graduating, hundreds of kids graduating every year with the skills. You can take someone who maybe has 2 years of college and create a certificate program for them to do curation. You don't need, it doesn't take 4 years to learn how to curate. You just need to have a vision and a focus, and somebody train you to see through a certain lens. And if you already have some liberal arts background, you can build on that with a certificate, and they can easily recruit people for that here or wherever there's a deficit of Black people in those fields. That can be done. And then my question is, how did the Office of Planning miss the mark and have to go back and re-include things when they had that huge charrette at the library, and they were going around to all the different agencies, and people were writing down and talking, and it was loud, and people were making their voices heard, and they had all these circles where people were giving their input. How did they miss all the street level input? Then you had to catch it and go back and tell them, well, put this in and put that in.
I can't speak. I don't think they miss the street level input here in DC. I mean, I don't think that would.
You were saying that the first draft of the plan didn't have.
No, not first draft of the plan. The first draft of the legislation establishing the plan. So it was before. It was not the plan itself. My understanding of the plan and the meetings that I've gone through, and if you go to the website, the Office of Planning has been very focused on what they call citizen engagement, and that has formed a basis for much of their planning. So as far as planning, legislation goes, what often drives legislation is a set of interests. And what drove and this is not a criticism, in fact, it's praise, it was the arts community that drove the development of the legislation. So if you go write legislation and you're driving it, you're going to use what? You're going to write it in your terminology, right? And so that's all that was. I mean, I don't think it was an attempt to exclude humanities, but once we saw the legislation and we pointed that out, the Director of Planning and Eric Shaw and Councilmember Grasso said that was just an oversight, and that the plan, the cultural plan, is not just an arts plan, but it is a cultural plan. So no, so let me clear the record. Office of Planning, this was not something. In fact, what the Office of Planning did was to take the Humanities DC reports and use that as the basis for crafting the RFP to select the contractor. So they heard us, and not only did they heard us, but they actually used our language. So that's. Let me just leave. Okay, I'll say my last anecdote after Jarvis speaks.
I just wanted to address the comment about certificates for curation. I'm in that museum studies program at Duke Ellington, and I think that we have to be careful about giving people certificates in leadership because it takes quite a bit to be a curator. And to think that you take X number of credit hours and you get your certificate to speak about culture, no matter what level we're talking about it on, I think does a disservice that happens within the arts community already, that people don't realize that it is culture that moves society. And one of the things that we have, I'll say, issues with in trying to get students to come in, because one is trying to find students who think that, one, museums are boring, okay? And that's something that they don't really want to get into. But our approach in museum studies is that if you have an interest in culture, no matter what that is, then come into our program and we will give you the skills and the talent to move yourself further when you go to college. A lot of the students who come to Duke Ellington feel that they are talented, and they do have a certain talent or skill set. But as I used to tell my students, even at Howard University, that talent is nothing more than a prerequisite. You're supposed to be talented. That's nothing extra. Your vision on top of that talent is the thing that makes you exceptional. And if we are going to create leaders in culture, we need people who are going to be exceptional. Even if that certificate is for you, we have to let that student or that person know that this gives you enough of a credential to move forward to the next step. But in and of itself, it is definitely not enough. It's like, as a photographer, everybody feels that they are a photographer because they have an iPhone. Oh, I have the iPhone 7. So what? You know, that's great that you have that access to tell your story, but even when you see these ads of, oh, full-length movies are being made with an iPhone, now that's marketing, okay? Because those people who are doing that with that iPhone have a background in film that lets them know that I'm also going to need 2 more audio pieces. I'm going to need another exceptional lens to put on top of that. And you're going to wind up with your iPhone looking just like this camera when it's all said and done. Nobody is going out there making a feature-length film with their phone. So it's important for us to understand the importance and the depth that's needed to tell cultural stories. That's it.
So Lydia, if you look up here in the left-hand corner, what's the slogan that goes under the Create New York City? It's the culture plan for what?
All New York.
And what's the slogan for the
DC Lottery.
DC Lottery?
This is our town, our neighborhoods with the F. We love this place as much as you do. And who's the you? I just love that.
All right, well,
That is genius.
so one last tourism story before, and then we'll wrap up and we can have some informal conversation. Again, I don't remember the dates and the time, but the city of Las Vegas tried to shift its marketing program to make it family friendly. Okay. And so they had this family friendly marketing program, bring your families to Las Vegas. I think that marketing program was a flop. And that was replaced by, if it happens in Vegas,
Stays in Vegas.
see?
It's total opposite.
So total opposite. But if it happens, so and then so when people go to Vegas, you ask them what you do in Vegas, what do they say? What do they say?
They just repeat that slogan.
Oh yeah, right. I can't tell you. Right. So, but this whole, not that anybody has done, anything that is illegal or anything, but the whole notion that there's this mystique about what goes on in Vegas became the marketing tool for people to rally around, not just for people who live in Las Vegas, but for people who come. So, kind of getting that theme right, and a culture plan for all New Yorkers. It's all our neighborhoods. Whatever that theme is becomes important, whether it's the winning football team or the winning basketball team or the winning soccer team, winning hockey team. There are these cultural engagements that can bring people together. And also there are these cultural engagements that also allow for the honoring of all the voices that exist in a jurisdiction. And it's the contention of Humanities DC and those in the DC Living Heritage Network that the DC Culture Plan should promote the culture of DC and honor all the cultures inside of DC. So I'll end with that. Thank you very much.